Hello ladies and gentlemen, I am the Omni viewer, and I'm going to open this video with an axiom about entertainment you may have heard before. There are no bad ideas, only bad executions. Now what that means is, if you see a movie or read a book and it's really bad, don't be too quick to blame it on the premise itself, because under different circumstances that premise might actually prove to be quite brilliant. For a good example of what I'm talking about, let's turn to my favorite movie monster, Godzilla.
The Millennium chapter of the Godzilla series ran from 1999 to 2004, and it was sort of directionless for the most part. Toho didn't really have a plan for the series, so they went with the old see what sticks to the wall method and produced no less than 3 false starts before settling on a continuity that was abandoned after 2 entries in favor of this X-Men knockoff. That's not to say this period didn't produce some good content or bring important innovations to the franchise, but in general it was sort of a squandered opportunity for the studio.
However, that lack of continuity led to something rarely seen in ongoing film series. The same movie was essentially made twice, and that brings me back around to my initial point, because they both serve as interesting examples of how the same premise can be done in vastly different ways. Those 2 films are known internationally as Godzilla vs. Megaguirus and Godzilla against Mechagodzilla.
These 2 movies share a lot of story elements. In both films, Godzilla is the antagonist, the focus is on a special anti-kaiju branch of the military, there's an established timeline to fill the 50-year gap after the 1954 original, the plot hinges on implementing a powerful new superweapon, and the human protagonist is a career military woman haunted by her past with Godzilla. These similarities are not coincidental, as both films were written by Wataru Mimura and directed by Masaki Tezuka. There is also a musical link between the 2, as the scores for both films were composed by Michiro Oshima. So, was this just a case of laziness, what with the same creative team making the same movie twice? It could be. Or maybe they did it twice because they thought they could do it better the second time around.
As always, I will be honest with you guys. I don't really like Godzilla vs. Megaguirus. It's not the worst Godzilla movie I've ever seen, but it's below average at best.
When I finished watching it the first time it aired on the Sci-Fi Channel 100 years ago, I immediately knew that it was bad, and not in the charmingly campy way other G films are bad. So a couple of years later, when I sat down to watch Godzilla against Mechagodzilla for the first time, and I heard the same musical cues from Megaguirus, I was bracing myself for the worst. What I got was essentially the same movie, but done much better. I didn't even know it was made by the exact same people back then, but once I did find that out, I was impressed.
So how did they do it? How did the same people make the same movie twice to such different results? That's what we're going to find out.
There are 2 elements in particular that I think make Mechagodzilla better than Megaguirus. For starters, we have the handling of the plot itself.
When you boil them down to their most basic plots, both movies can be summarized thusly.
After decades worth of attacks by Godzilla and other kaiju, the Japanese self-defense force finally reaches the point of desperation, and thus an ultimate weapon is commissioned. That weapon is so powerful that it's practically guaranteed to defeat Godzilla, but said weapon is untested in the field and could potentially not work as planned.
Now, having heard that much, let me ask you this. Does that plot description sound like it could comfortably fit an extra foe for Godzilla to face? All you have to do is watch Godzilla vs. Megaguirus to see that the answer is no. The primary conflict is between Godzilla and the JSDF, and anything else is a distraction.
Now I know what some of you are thinking. Megaguirus and the Meganeula swarms don't just show up in the film out of the blue. They appear as a direct result of the new anti-Godzilla weapon. That, for the uninitiated, is Dimension Tide, a satellite equipped with a singularity generator that fires miniature black holes at terrestrial targets.
Yes, I know, that does sound like the worst idea ever. But, for the sake of staying on topic, we'll let that slide for now.
The first test of Dimension Tide unexpectedly opens a wormhole on the testing grounds, which are in an area so isolated that a little boy can get there on foot without the military-grade security noticing him.
Sorry, I really should stay on topic. But seriously, they couldn't have done this on an island or something?
Upon noticing this unexpected phenomenon, the G-Grasper's team proceeds to completely ignore it, which allows the Megaguirus access to modern Japan when nobody's looking.
Here's where we run into the problem.
While it's true the Megaguirus start off as an insidious, unforeseen consequence that isn't noticed until it's too late, once they are discovered, the G-Graspers don't really seem to care about them. Despite flooding Tokyo, killing several people, and disrupting the first use of Dimension Tide against Godzilla, they're treated as no more annoying than any other insect, to the point that the army doesn't even bother sending a properly equipped team to deal with them. Of course, the appearance of Megaguirus, Queen of the Swarm, should be the soil your pants moment, but the team all but forgets about her when they remember that Godzilla is their opponent, because he's the one everybody is laser focused on. Megaguirus at the worst is a problem for later.
This means that whenever the bugs show up, they don't feel like natural parts of the story, but instead feel like interruptions. Think I'm exaggerating? Look at the climax.
Godzilla makes landfall in Japan, like always, and the G-Graspers are ready to take another shot at him with Dimension Tide, but then Megaguirus shows up and the frequency of her beating wings shorts out all of the military's equipment, including the satellite for some reason. As the humans try to recover, she and Godzilla have their showdown, which is an admittedly satisfying bout. After the fight is over, though, there's still 10 minutes of movie left, and that's devoted to finishing the original plan that had to be put on hold for the Kaiju battle, and it is here that the emotions and tension achieve catharsis.
The title fight was just an interruption, and it had nothing to do with the bigger picture.
Despite being connected to the plot, Megaguirus and the Megaguirus are here in spite of the story, and are treated as afterthoughts. It makes me wonder if perhaps they weren't originally supposed to be there at all.
By contrast, Godzilla against Mechagodzilla figured out how to have its cake and eat it too.
As stated, the plot once again is about implementing a super weapon to use against Godzilla. In this case, though, the king doesn't have another opponent to get in the way of things because his opponent is the weapon.
Let's be honest here. Regardless of how logical Dimension Tide may be as a concept, it doesn't provide opportunities for Godzilla to do something interesting.
It's way up in the exosphere, calmly orbiting above the Earth as it waits to be fired at an opponent who doesn't even know it exists. That makes for a very impersonal conflict, something that should have been provided by Megaguirus, but wasn't. Here, though, we have Kiryu, the unofficial official name of Mechagodzilla 3, who fills the roles of both controversial new weapon and physical opponent for Godzilla.
In this movie, there are no distractions, and the title fight is the climax, just as it should be.
There are much deeper reasons for why the battle between Godzilla and Kiryu works so much better than the one between Godzilla and Megaguirus, but we'll get to that later.
There's something else worth mentioning in regards to this aspect, and that's how each movie respectively treats the original Godzilla.
Both Megaguirus and Mechagodzilla use the original 1954 movie as the starting point for their respective timelines. However, they both also make changes that could explain their different approaches to the same story. In Godzilla vs. Megaguirus, Godzilla's rampage in Tokyo ends with him returning to the ocean and then just staying quiet for a few years before popping up again in the 60s. No Dr. Serizawa, no oxygen destroyer, no bittersweet ending as the world is saved by the sacrifice of a brilliant man. Godzilla just leaves on his own.
Now, something that always rubbed me the wrong way about this movie was the G-Grasper's cavalier attitude in regards to using Dimension Tide.
Nobody seems bothered about the potential hazards of shooting a black hole at the planet or the consequences that might arise from said action so long as it gets rid of Godzilla. No one even seems to care that using Dimension Tide actually made things worse by bringing the Megaguirus into the picture, and thus no one takes responsibility for this potentially apocalyptic error.
It led to me actively rooting against the G-Graspers because their behavior came across as villainous. Though if I'm being honest, I can't say I'm surprised that this attitude exists in the film.
Like I said, this is set in a timeline where the oxygen destroyer was never used, so the lessons taught by that whole event never occurred either. With no precedent, the mindset of the world is altered.
Okay, so that in-universe lack of precedent may provide some explanation for why the characters have no issue with using such a horrifying weapon. But I can't help but wonder if there was supposed to be more to it than that.
From a thematic standpoint, it at first seems as if the movie is setting itself up to revisit that idea of escalation in modern times on a larger scale. After all, Dimension Tide has the potential to be far deadlier than Godzilla when working properly, but here we see it failing, malfunctioning, and doing things it wasn't even supposed to do at every turn. Yet in spite of all of that, no one ever questions a thing.
The setup is there, but the payoff never comes because of how haphazardly everything comes together. Either that or they were banking on a sequel to explore that theme further. Either way, the ball is dropped here and it winds up hurting the film.
In Godzilla against Mechagodzilla, however, the oxygen destroyer is not removed from the equation. It's still used to kill Godzilla, but the difference is that this time it doesn't dissolve the bones as it originally did, thus allowing the JSDF to use those bones in the making of Kiryu.
Is it mere coincidence then that this movie actually treats the arming of Japan with devastating new weapons as a controversial subject?
In a way, Kiryu is two weapons in one. First, he's the most advanced robot ever constructed, and he's specifically built for combat. Second, he's armed with the Absolute Zero cannon, a beam weapon which freezes its target.
In other words, it's akin to placing Dimension Tide into a terrestrial mech instead of an orbital satellite.
In the film, a demonstration of Kiryu using Absolute Zero gets a very strong reaction from everyone present, many of whom you may notice are not Japanese. This, combined with a lot of the dialogue that comes later, makes it clear that Kiryu's existence has thrust Japan back into the international spotlight. Now everyone is watching warily as they wait to see how Kiryu performs. So when the DNA computers running his system cause him to act like Godzilla and go on his own city-leveling rampage, it's a huge blow to the island nation.
When Dimension Tide doesn't work and causes more harm than good, nobody cares. But when the same happens to Kiryu, it matters.
Now using the robot is a risk because he might go haywire again, and if they change the DNA base to something else, he might not be a match for Godzilla anymore. So sending him to fight Godzilla at the end is not a decision made lightly.
Now, are these themes explored as thoroughly as they could be, especially in regards to how they relate to the original film? Well, not quite.
It stops just shy of getting too introspective, but nevertheless, there's still payoff for the setup we get, and it's pretty satisfying.
Collectively, that's a big difference between the two films. But there's a second difference that's just as significant, possibly even more so. That difference is in the characters. Once again, we see that the two films have many parallels, but how they are executed leads to one surpassing the other.
In Godzilla vs. Megaguirus, our protagonist is Major Kiriko Sugimori, a career military woman driven to defeat Godzilla.
Unfortunately, that's the only thing we know. Kiriko has no substance to her.
She wants to kill Godzilla, but why she wants to kill him is never really explored, even when it's directly brought up by a kid who doesn't realize how sexist his phrasing is.
The prologue scene in 1996 should be where we learn that reason, but it's not.
Her squadron is comprised entirely of foot soldiers armed with rocket launchers, and since their opponent is freaking Godzilla, the mission goes about as well as you'd expect.
She winds up being the only survivor, and this fills her with righteous fury. But why does it fill her with righteous fury?
It seems that she was most affected by the death of her commanding officer, but it's unclear why she's so attached to him. Their relationship is never defined. Were they friends? Lovers? Was he her surrogate father figure? Did she idolize him from afar? The most we ever get is that he gave her a mantra to live by, but that alone doesn't justify her behavior. Since their relationship is never defined, we don't know why she reacts so strongly to his death, resulting in Kiriko seeming needlessly vindictive towards Godzilla. There's a bit more to say on this subject, but we'll get to that later.
And as for the rest of the cast, well, they're superfluous.
Despite there being a lot of characters in the film, most of them don't have very much to do and thus wind up feeling like they're present only to fill space. You have the scientist who made Dimension Tide, the other scientist who's there only to deliver exposition about the Megaguirus, the military commanders who stand there, the pilots who are also in the film, and the people who sit at control panels and look like they're doing stuff. You could remove most of them, but then the sets would look a lot emptier.
To be fair, there are 3 characters aside from Kiriko who do have a reason to be there, but they're still not very interesting.
Kudo is meant to be both the comic relief and the potential love interest, while simultaneously being a genius who specializes in miniaturization.
I'm sure there's something Freudian about that, but I'm not diving down that rabbit hole today.
Unfortunately, his comedy comes across as cringy and annoying, as do his weak romantic attempts, and his miniaturization specialty doesn't really serve much purpose after he uses it on Dimension Tide at the start of the film. Then there's Jun, the little boy obsessed with insects who transports the Megaguirus egg to Tokyo. However, once he's served the purpose of moving the egg to where it can do the most damage, he doesn't have much else to do either, so he eventually vanishes, which makes him little more than a plot convenience. Finally, there's Mr. Sugiura, the corrupt politician involved in illegal energy research that lures Godzilla ashore, thus making him the real villain of the film, but that's not revealed until the very end, so it comes way too late to matter.
Now in Godzilla against Mechagodzilla, we see a similar setup with far less fat that needs trimming.
This movie has Lieutenant Akane Yoshiro, who is very similar to Kiriko at a glance. Just like Kiriko, Akane was part of a military response to Godzilla, and she was the only survivor after the unit was thoroughly trounced, but the similarities end there.
You see, in this case, the failure of the anti-Megalosaur unit to repel Godzilla and the resulting fatalities are kinda sorta in a roundabout way Akane's fault.
The Maser tanks probably weren't going to do much to Godzilla anyway, though they were a much better choice than bazookas, but Akane panics and rams a jeep, putting the occupants right in Godzilla's path. This also allows Godzilla to finish off the whole unit before they can retreat, leaving only Akane alive. It's an accident, sure, and at least a few people acknowledge that Akane is not really to blame, but she still shoulders the responsibility all the same. In fact, at least some of the blame she shoulders is self-inflicted due to her survivor's guilt.
But that's just when we first meet her. As the film progresses, we learn more about why she reacts the way she does.
It's true that, like Kiriko, we never learn how close she was to the other people in her squadron, but that ultimately isn't the point this time around. You see, we gradually come to understand that Akane puts all value on the lives of others and places none on her own. She views herself as worthless and disposable, deserving only of contempt and blame, a mindset implied to be rooted in her childhood.
You may notice times in the film when she stands up for others, but she never stands up for herself.
In this scene, a pilot named Hayama comes in and berates her as scum, for his brother died thanks to her mistake, and she just sits there and takes it. When Tokimitsu tries standing up for her and gets pushback for it, that's when she steps in, saying Hayama went too far.
She hasn't even met Tokimitsu before this moment, and she still sees his life as more valuable than her own.
This also leads to her forming an unusual kinship with Kiryu. Being run on DNA computers, Kiryu is somewhat of a cyborg, a living thing comprised mostly of machinery, but he exists for the sole purpose of being a weapon. By definition, Kiryu is considered a dangerous object to be used however his controllers want, and to be disposed of if he fails.
In a way, Kiryu's life can also be viewed as worthless because his value is based on his performance, and failure to perform to standard can result in his termination.
Enter Sarah, the little girl who serves a far greater purpose than moving an egg from one place to another.
Sarah is not wise beyond her years. She's still a child and views the world with a childlike simplicity. But sometimes that simplicity is just what someone needs to hear.
She and her father Tokimitsu form an unconventional family, as there's no mother in the picture. The mother died when she was pregnant with another child, who also didn't survive, and according to Tokimitsu, Sarah has been sensitive about life and death ever since. As a result, Sarah feels sorry for Kiryu and is upset by Akane's self-deprecating philosophy. As she puts it, being alive is all it takes for life to have value.
This revelation is precisely what Akane needs. Throughout the film, in spite of her self-loathing, she is presented with evidence that she is valued.
Tokimitsu takes an instant liking to her, even though he's very awkward when expressing it. All of Kiryu's squadron, Hayama notwithstanding, accept her as part of the team despite her reputation. The very fact that she was selected as Kiryu's pilot means she is recognized as valuable. Yet she is unable to accept these facts until Sarah lays them out for her in no uncertain terms. So at the end, when she takes manual control of Kiryu, the living weapon seen by the world as a hazard that might not be worth keeping, the two essentially become a single entity, fighting not just to protect Tokyo, but to prove that their lives are not worthless. It's been said that the best kaiju movies intertwine the human and kaiju stories, and this is one of the best examples of how it's done.
I haven't spoken much about Godzilla yet, have I? Better correct that. At first glance, this might seem like the one advantage Godzilla vs. Megaguirus has over Godzilla against Mechagodzilla.
The Mechagodzilla version of the king has an excellent design, but the characterization leaves a lot to be desired. I don't know if it was an issue with the suit or a directorial choice, but this Godzilla is not very mobile, making him sluggish at best and unresponsive at worst. That would be improved upon in the sequel, thank the Lord, but it would be unfair of me to award extra points for that. Meanwhile, Megaguirus delivers a Godzilla that's alert, active, responsive, quick, and intelligent.
In that regard, Godzilla vs. Megaguirus does have the clear advantage. And yet, Godzilla against Mechagodzilla still does something that puts it over its predecessor. In both films, Godzilla is cast as the antagonist. But where Godzilla vs. Megaguirus stumbles is putting the G-Man in a gray zone without really doing anything significant with it.
Although this Godzilla is no friend to mankind, we eventually learn that he comes to Tokyo because of an illegal plasma energy experiment. Specifically, it's illegal because it attracts Godzilla, but the people profiting from it don't care as long as they can line their pockets. Furthermore, the G-Graspers wind up making a bad situation worse when Dimension Tide unleashes the Meganulla and Megaguirus on Japan, and it's Godzilla who cleans up that mess.
Sure, it's not done out of altruism, but Godzilla still saves Japan from a threat it wasn't prepared for, a threat that was arguably of its own making. This implies that Godzilla is not a true villain. So why does the movie keep insisting that he is?
Even though this gray area is apparent to the audience, the characters in the movie act as if it doesn't exist, and that dissonance just doesn't sit well with me. Hence, I root for Godzilla in spite of the movie's insistence that I treat him as the bad guy, and thus I cheer when he returns in The Stinger.
Meanwhile, Godzilla against Mechagodzilla also casts the G-Man as the villain, but is careful not to contradict itself in doing so.
We don't really get a solid reason as to why Godzilla shows up. That comes in the next movie, and as I said earlier, no extra points for the sequel. All we know in this film is that Godzilla is a threat that needs to be dealt with. There are no human antagonists manipulating things behind the scenes, or kaiju antagonists that Godzilla must defeat because no one else can. Thus, the gray area is removed, and Godzilla remains the villain for the heroes to overcome. I don't doubt that some may balk at the prospect of promoting a morally black and white story over a morally gray story, but a story that doesn't realize it's gray won't take advantage of it, so a black and white story is the better choice.
By now, I have covered a lot of talking points about how these two movies diverge from each other while still treading similar ground. But on the off chance that you don't think any of them work, there's still one last case I can make for why Godzilla against Mechagodzilla is better than Godzilla vs. Megaguirus. And that comes down to the execution of character arcs.
You might have heard this classic bit of writing advice before. A good story has a character start out wanting something, but end up realizing what they need and striving for that instead. That need could very well be contrary to the initial want, which would demonstrate character development.
Now let's take everything we've established about these two movies and see what happens when we view them through this theory.
At the beginning of Godzilla vs. Megaguirus, Kiriko's want is obvious. She wants to kill Godzilla because she sees him as the ultimate enemy.
However, the film throws multiple monkey wrenches into that perception.
Godzilla is shown to not really be evil, nor is he actively hostile. He's just coming to Japan to get food. Kiriko and the G-Graspers take extreme measures to deal with Godzilla, but that winds up causing even bigger issues that Godzilla ends up solving for them. Finally, the real villain is shown to be a corrupt political system conducting illegal experiments. At worst, Godzilla is a symptom of a much greater disease, but his battle with Megaguirus introduces the possibility that he might be a force for good in certain circumstances. With that in mind, Kiriko should have abandoned her want and realized her need. Let go of her hatred and refocus her attention on the real problems.
Ergo, the best possible ending for Godzilla vs. Megaguirus Indeed, the only thematically appropriate one would have been for Kiriko to allow Dimension Tide to burn up as it fell back to Earth and let Godzilla go. But she doesn't.
She continues to see Godzilla as the ultimate enemy and pulls a kamikaze maneuver to defeat him. She could potentially die, but that doesn't seem to matter as long as she gets what she wants. It is therefore safe to say that Kiriko has no character arc and openly rejects having one. In Godzilla against Mechagodzilla, Akane's initial want is to atone for her perceived wrongdoings, regardless of whether or not she is even guilty. She isolates herself, silently accepts abuse, and never attempts to excuse or explain herself for anything.
Over the course of the film, however, this perception is also stripped away layer by layer.
For starters, she is entrusted with Japan's greatest weapon despite her past. She then encounters people who either don't know her reputation or don't care, but in both cases accept her as both a valued member of the team and a genuinely good young woman. The only person who actively antagonizes her is portrayed as clearly in the wrong, is called on it, and undergoes his own arc as a result. Finally, she has her philosophy directly challenged by Sara, and in the midst of the final battle, she finally realizes the truth.
Her want to atone is replaced by her need to accept her own value.
This is accompanied by a do-over of sorts at the end, where the circumstances allow her to save Hayama, who willingly places himself in Godzilla's line of fire to aid in the fight. So in this case, Akane does have a character arc, and it's a very satisfying one to boot.
I suppose there's another lesson to be learned here. Not just that there are no bad ideas, only bad executions, but also that the good executions can be done by the same people who did the bad executions. And if that's not your cup of tea, it's still interesting to contrast these two movies and see how they can be so similar and yet so incredibly different. Until such time as we meet again, this is the Omni Viewer signing off. I also have to say, Kiryu is my second favorite Mechagodzilla design after the original. Except for those big black shoulder cannons and wrist gauntlets. Those were just ugly.
If you enjoyed this video, you know what to do. Like and subscribe, then go down to the description to find links to follow us on DeviantArt, Patreon, and Twitter. While you're there, you'll also find the Amazon links for the original novels Operation Red Dragon, The Daikaiju Wars Part 1, and The Occult Mafia. 2 books I think you'll really enjoy. Thank you all, and we appreciate your support.